Welcome to the Frontier Travelers. Pull up a chair and turn up the volume because today's journey takes us to the ragged edge of the galaxy, where love is rare and danger is a constant companion. If you appreciate good stories and the old codes of honor, hit that like button and subscribe to The Last Outrider. The universe was screaming, and Rusty Vance was screaming back. Not with his voice, but with his hands, fighting the controls of a ship that was coming apart around him like wet paper. Metal shrieked. Alarms blared a frantic, useless chorus, and through the cockpit's viewport, the uncatalogued planet of Viridia Canyons grew from a beautiful green marble into a fast-approaching wall of death. I told you that asteroid field wasn't on the charts for a reason, you magnificent idiot. Betsy's voice crackled through the comms, a synthetic snarl of static and recrimination. Her synthesized British accent, usually dripping with condescending wit, was frayed with panic. Unstable gravitational tides. Even a human with a brain eroded by cheap whiskey and sad music should have seen that. Just keep the damn life support from quitting on me, Betsy. Rusty grunted, his biceps and shoulders straining as he wrestled the yoke. The muscles corded in his arms, thick as starship cabling, fought against physics and fate. Outside, the atmosphere ignited, turning the view into a roaring tunnel of incandescent plasma. He could feel the heat seeping through the hull, a promise of cremation. In the chaos, his thumb found a well-worn button on the console. A snarling guitar riff, raw and defiant, ripped through the cockpit. A relic from a dead world called Earth, Creedence Clearwater Revival. It was the only prayer he knew. Oh, brilliant! We're going to die, and our final moments will be scored by swamp rock, Betsy lamented. At least have the decency to play something classical. It is classical, Rusty said through clenched teeth. The ground was visible now, a terrifying tapestry of colossal green canyons and impossibly lush jungles. He pulled back on the yoke with everything he had, the ship groaning in its final agony. He wasn't trying to land. He was just trying to crash in a way that left enough of him to be buried. The last thing he saw before the world dissolved into a concussive roar and shattering glass was the ghost of a woman's face, a memory that haunted the space between stars, the promise he had broken. Then, only the blackness, silent and absolute. Consciousness returned not as a rush but as a slow, creeping tide. It began with sound, a low, resonant hum, like the thrumming of a giant heart, somewhere deep in the earth. It was a peaceful sound, a stark contrast to the violent symphony of the crash. Next came smell, damp soil, rich and loamy, the sweet, heavy perfume of flowers he'd never known, and an undercurrent of something clean, like ozone after a lightning strike. His body ached, a deep, bone-weary ache that spoke of violent impact and unnatural rest. He tried to move, and a groan escaped his lips, rough and unused. His inventory of pain was extensive, a stabbing fire in his ribs, a dull throb in his head, and the raw scrape of abrasions across his arms and back. But he was alive, and he wasn't in the mangled cockpit of the Betsy. Rusty forced his eyes open. The light was soft, indirect, and green. He was in a vast cavern, but it was unlike any cave he'd ever seen. The walls weren't bare stone. They were covered in a thick, velvety moss that pulsed with a gentle internal bioluminescence. Veins of brighter green light like living circuits crisscrossed the ceiling high above, casting the entire space in an ethereal twilight. Strange, pearlescent fungi grew in clusters, some resembling delicate, hand-blown glass sculptures. The air was warm and humid, clinging to his skin. It felt less like a cave and more like the womb of the planet itself. He was lying on a bed of something. It was softer than any mattress, a deep pile of the same glowing moss woven with what felt like thick, cool silk. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, the world tilting precariously. He was shirtless. His tactical pants were torn, but his heavy leather vest and boots were gone. His skin was clean, and he could see where crude but effective poultices of dark green leaves had been applied to his worst cuts. Someone had tended to him. Panic, the cold friend of any man who lives on the edge, began to prick at his senses. His sidearm was missing. His comm unit was gone. He was injured, unarmed, and in a place that shouldn't exist. He listened, filtering out the hum of the cavern. He heard breathing, soft, rhythmic, and plural. Slowly he turned his head. They were watching him. Scattered throughout the cavern were figures, their forms half hidden in the gentle shadows. They were female, humanoid, and moved with a silent, deliberate grace that was both captivating and unnerving. Their skin was the color of polished jade, ranging in shade from pale celadon to deep forest green. They were tall and slender, with elegant limbs and a posture that spoke of innate dignity. Their faces were beautiful, with high cheekbones, full lips, and large dark eyes that seemed to hold no pupils, only the deep, reflective black of a starless night sky. Faint, intricate patterns like tribal tattoos glowed with the same soft, bioluminescent light as the moss, swirling across their arms, shoulders, and faces. Each pattern was unique, a living constellation on their skin. They wore simple, form-fitting garments made from a woven, plant-like fiber, leaving their arms and legs bare. They held no weapons. They simply stood, or sat, their obsidian eyes fixed on him. There was no menace in their gaze, no hostility. It was something far more unsettling. It was reverence, awe, as if he were a religious icon that had just fallen from the heavens. One of them stepped forward, moving out of the shadows and into a brighter patch of light. She was older than the others, her bioluminescent markings more complex, forming a pattern that resembled a crown of starlight across her brow. Her bearing was regal, her gaze intense. It held a sorrow so profound it was almost a physical weight, but beneath it, a desperate, burning flicker of hope. She was their leader. That much was clear. Rusty pushed himself into a sitting position, ignoring the searing pain in his ribs. His training, buried under layers of weariness and regret, kicked in. Assess the situation, find an exit, identify the threat. But his instincts were confused. These creatures didn't register as threats. They watched him the way a starving man might watch a banquet materialize from thin air. The leader approached his moss bed, her bare feet making no sound on the cavern floor. She stopped a few feet away, her dark eyes scanning his form, his broad chest, the thick muscles of his arms, the scars that crisscrossed his torso like a roadmap of a hard-lived life. She wasn't looking at him with desire, not in the way he understood it. It was more like appraisal, like a farmer examining a prize bull, or a priest beholding a miracle. She raised a hand, long, elegant fingers hesitating in the air between them. Her expression was a complex mixture of fear and longing. The other females watched, their collective breath held. The entire cavern, the entire world seemed to be waiting for his reaction. Rusty remained still, his heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against his bruised ribs. He met her gaze, the gaze of this alien queen in her subterranean kingdom. He had faced down pirates in the Tantalus Rift, outdrunk gargantuan miners on Solitude 7, and navigated the treacherous politics of Hadrian's Perch. He was a man who had made a home in the lonely, violent vacuum of space. But this was different. This wasn't a fight for survival. This felt like a judgment. She finally spoke. Her voice was like the cavern's hum given melody, low, musical, and filled with an ancient sadness. The words were in a language he couldn't understand, a series of soft clicks and long, flowing vowels. But the meaning, the desperate plea behind the sound, was universal. She took one more step forward, her courage finally winning out. Her glowing fingertips gently, reverently, touched the center of his chest, right over his heart. The touch was not a threat. It was a benediction, and in her dark, fathomless eyes, he saw the reflection of a man he no longer thought he was. Not a drifter, not a runner, but a savior. He was their precious thing, their last, desperate hope, and Rusty Vance had no idea why. Rusty Vance was a man who understood pressure. He'd felt it in the bone-creaking G-forces of an emergency burn, in the cold vacuum of a compromised EVA suit, and in the dead-eyed stare of a man he was about to kill. But this was different. The pressure from Zelia's touch was not physical. It was the crushing weight of expectation, the silent, desperate gravity of 1,000 souls channeled through one elegant hand. Her skin was cool, her touch feather-light, yet it anchored him more firmly than any chain. He didn't pull away. A lifetime of instincts screamed at him to create distance, to establish a defensible position, but he held his ground. He met her gaze. His own eyes narrowed, searching for the trick, the angle. There was none. There was only a chasm of sorrow and a fragile, terrifying tendril of hope reaching out for him. Zelia withdrew her hand slowly, as if breaking a delicate circuit. She turned and spoke to her people, her voice a series of melodic, authoritative commands. The other females, who had been watching with breathless intensity, moved with a unified purpose. They brought him water in a cup carved from some kind of iridescent shell. It was cool and tasted of minerals and earth. They brought him food, soft purple fruits that burst in his mouth with a sweet, tangy flavor, and strips of something like jerky, savory and tough. He ate. A man couldn't fight or flee on an empty stomach. As he ate, Zilia sat on the cavern floor before him, a queen content with the dirt of her kingdom. She watched him, not as a captor watches a prisoner, but as a scholar watches a new star ignite in the heavens. When he was finished, she raised her hand again, not towards him, but towards the cavern wall. The soft green light of the mosses brightened, the intricate living circuits on the walls pulsed, and the light began to coalesce. Dust motes, caught in the shifting illumination, danced like tiny stars. Zilia moved her fingers through the air as if conducting an orchestra of light and shadow. On the vast, dark canvas of the stone wall, an image began to form. It was a mural painted in pure luminescence. First, she showed him her people. The light depicted a world teeming with them, viridians of both genders. The males were there, taller, broader, their bioluminescent patterns sharper, more angular. They were builders, hunters, fathers. The light showed them raising structures that echoed the twisting canyons outside, tending to gardens of glowing fungi and holding small, laughing children whose skin glowed with faint, new patterns. It was a history of a vibrant, thriving civilization, a silent, beautiful film of a world in its prime. Rusty watched, a stone in his gut. He knew what came next. The good times never lasted. The light flickered, the idyllic scene corrupting. A new shape emerged from the shadows at the edge of the mural. It was a hulking, reptilian beast, low to the ground, with thick, armored plates and a maw filled with needle-like teeth, the Grak Theron. But the image didn't just show it as a predator hunting its prey. Zilia's light painting was more subtle, more insidious. It showed the beast fouling the rivers with a dark slick, its very presence seeming to wither the plants it passed. It was a walking plague. The mural shifted again. The viridian males began to change. The light depicting them grew dimmer, their forms becoming stooped and frail. The sharp angles of their glowing patterns softened, blurred, and then faded entirely. She showed scenes of sickness, of females tending to their listless mates, their expressions etched with a confusion that slowly curdled into despair. The scenes of children being born grew fewer and fewer, until they stopped completely. The last image was of the final male, his own light extinguished, fading into the stone like a dying ember. The cavern was filled with a profound, unspoken grief. Rusty could feel it emanating from the silent women around him, a sorrow so old it had become a part of the air they breathed. Now, only the females remained. The light showed them fighting the Grak Therons, but they were not warriors. They were survivors, fighting a losing battle against a monster that had already stolen their future. Then, Zilia made a final, grand gesture. The light streaked across the top of the mural, a falling star, blazing through a night sky. It crashed into the green earth in a shower of fire and shrapnel. From the smoking crater a figure emerged, a silhouette, broad-shouldered and powerful, a being of impossible health and vitality, an outworlder, a male. The light figure looked exactly like him. As the figure stood, the ground around his feet began to glow with renewed life. Dormant plants bloomed, and the faded patterns on the watching females brightened with a vibrant, hopeful intensity. Zilia turned from the mural, her dark eyes locking with his. The light show was over. The silent plea was now a spoken demand. The Sower of Stars, her gaze seemed to say, the one who will bring back the light. Rusty felt a cold dread wash over him, colder than the vacuum of space. He finally understood. They didn't want a warrior. They didn't want a king. They wanted a stud, a biological key to restart their entire civilization. He was their last, desperate gamble against total extinction. The sheer, overwhelming scale of their need threatened to swallow him whole. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the protest of his ribs. He needed to move, to pace, to feel the solid ground beneath his boots, except his boots were gone. He was barefoot, a primal, untethered feeling. He stalked the perimeter of the cavern, the viridian females parting before him like reeds in a river. He saw it all with a new clarity. The lack of men, the absence of children, the desperate, almost holy reverence in their eyes. This wasn't a prison, it was a temple, and he was the unwilling god on the altar. His mind flashed back, unbidden, to another promise, another life. A woman with hair the color of spun gold and eyes as blue as Earth's forgotten oceans. He remembered the weight of her head on his shoulder, the whisper of a promise he had made in the dark. "We'll build something that lasts, Rusty. A home, a family, something real." He remembered the fire, the twisted metal, the cold, hard silence that followed. He had failed. He had run. He had encased his heart in the cold iron of his ship and fled to the farthest, loneliest corners of the galaxy so he would never have to build anything again, so he would never have to fail anyone again. And now, the universe, in its infinite, cruel sense of humor, had brought him here. It had given him the one thing he was running from, the chance to create life, to build a future, to a people who needed it more than anything. It was a cosmic joke with a punchline that felt like a knife in the gut. Days bled into one another in the timeless green twilight of the nest. He learned their routines. They were a quiet, industrious people, tending to their glowing gardens and maintaining the intricate ecosystem of the caverns. They treated him with a gentle, cautious respect. They brought him his meals, mended his torn clothes with surprising skill, and tended to his injuries with a quiet efficiency. Zelia was a constant presence. She taught him words in her clicking, melodic language. Vor, water; Kale, food; Zelia, her name, which meant last daughter; and Rusty, a sound they could not quite replicate, which came out as Rusty, the sound of a stone being struck against steel. It meant the hope. One cycle, as he sat cleaning a fresh wound on his arm from a careless slip, she came and sat beside him. She took the cloth from his hand and began to clean the abrasion herself, her touch infinitely more gentle. Her fingers, cool and long, traced the network of old scars on his arm. She looked up at him, her dark eyes asking a question her lips could not form. "A long life," Rusty said in his own tongue, the words feeling rough and heavy in the quiet cavern. "A lot of mistakes." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, the weary resignation, the ghosts behind his eyes. She placed her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart, just as she had when he first awoke. This time the gesture felt different, less like a priestess anointing a relic and more like a woman trying to understand the man trapped inside the myth. He felt a pull towards her, a dangerous, magnetic attraction. He was drawn to her strength, her quiet dignity, the immense burden she carried without complaint. In her he saw a reflection of his own solitude, a loneliness born of duty, while his was born of flight. But to let himself feel anything for her would be to accept the role they had given him, to become the Sower, to risk breaking another promise, this time to an entire race. That night, as the cavern hummed its deep terrestrial lullaby, he couldn't sleep. He sat in the darkness, the faces of the Viridian females watching him from the shadows, their hope a tangible, suffocating blanket. In the silence of his own mind, he heard a new song, not the defiant roar of rock and roll, but the low, mournful cry of a slide guitar, a deep, Delta blues track, a song about a man with the weight of the world on his shoulders, a man at a crossroads, with the devil on one side and the deep blue sea on the other. He closed his eyes. He had crashed on this planet, but he was more stranded now than he had been in the wreckage. Stranded between a past he couldn't outrun and a future he couldn't bear to face. The peace, fragile as it was, could not last. Rusty knew this in his bones, the same way a veteran sailor knows the feel of a storm-heavy sky. The Viridian nest was a sanctuary, but it was a sanctuary under siege. The Graktharans were out there, in the oppressive humidity and tangled green hell of the jungle canyons, and their world had been disturbed by the fiery arrival of a new, potent variable, him. The attack came without warning. There was no battle cry, no thunder of approaching feet, just a sudden, piercing shriek from one of the outer tunnels that cut through the cavern's gentle hum like a shard of glass. It was a sound of pure animal terror, followed by the sickening crunch of bone and a wet, tearing noise. The tranquil atmosphere of the nest shattered instantly. Panic, cold and electric, rippled through the Viridian females. They were not warriors. They were gardeners, caretakers, historians. They scattered, their graceful movements turning frantic and clumsy as they sought the safety of the deeper chambers. But Zelia stood her ground, her face a mask of resolute dread. She held a sharpened harvesting tool, a long stick tipped with obsidian, but it looked like a child's toy against the horror that was coming. Rusty was already moving. Adrenaline, the old familiar friend, burned through his veins like high-octane fuel. His fatigue, his emotional turmoil, his existential dread, It all vanished, burned away by the clean, sharp focus of combat. He was no longer a symbol, a prophecy, or a broken man. He was a soldier. He ripped a long, thick support beam from a garden trellis, the wood dense and heavy in his hands. It wasn't a pulse rifle, but it would have to do. He moved to Zilia's side, planting his bare feet wide on the mossy floor, his body a bulwark between her and the tunnel entrance. The difference between them was stark. She, tall and elegant, a figure of tragic nobility. He, a slab of scarred muscle and grim intent, a creature built for violence. From the darkened tunnel, the first Graktheron emerged. It was even more grotesque up close than in Zelia's light mural. It was a reptilian nightmare, a crocodile bred with a battering ram. Its hide was a mottled, sickly green-brown, thick as armor plating. It moved low to the ground on 6 powerful clawed legs, its long, muscular tail whipping back and forth. Its head was a wedge of solid bone, and its jaw, filled with rows of needle-thin teeth, dripped with a viscous black saliva. But its eyes were the worst part, small, yellow, and burning with a malevolent, cunning intelligence. This was no dumb beast. This was a thinking killer, and it stank of rot and ozone, the smell of the poison it carried in its very being. It saw Rusty, and it paused. The small, hateful eyes widened in something like surprise. It tilted its massive head, its forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. It had come expecting the familiar scent of female prey, of fear and weakness. Instead, it smelled something new, something male, something dangerous. The beast let out a chuffing hiss, a sound of challenge. Rusty didn't hesitate. He charged. He roared. A guttural, primal sound dredged up from the depths of his soul, a sound of rage and frustration and the sheer, glorious release of action. He swung the heavy wooden beam like a titan swinging a hammer, putting all his weight and muscle behind the blow. The impact was cataclysmic. Wood met armored bone with a sound like a small explosion, echoing through the cavern. The beam shattered, sending splinters flying, but the force of the blow was immense. The Graktheron's head snapped to the side with a sickening crack. It staggered, shaking its head, a low growl of pain and fury rumbling in its chest. It was hurt, but not down. It lunged, its maw gaping. Rusty was already moving, sidestepping the charge, the creature's fetid breath washing over him. As it passed, he brought a savage kick into its side, aiming for the softer flesh between its armored plates. He felt ribs give way under his heel. The beast squealed, a high-pitched sound of agony, and stumbled, crashing into a cluster of glowing fungi, which burst in a shower of pearlescent spores. 2 more beasts scuttled out of the tunnel, drawn by the commotion. The Viridian females cried out in despair. Zilia moved to join him, her obsidian spear held ready. "No! Get back!" Rusty yelled, the English words useless but the tone unmistakable. "Keep them back." He pointed with a bloodied hand towards the deeper tunnels where the others were hiding. Zilia understood. Her duty was to her people. With a last anguished look at him, she turned and herded the other females toward safety, her voice a sharp, commanding presence amidst the fear. Now Rusty was alone, facing 3 of the monsters. The first one he'd hit was back on its feet, its yellow eyes blazing with murderous rage. They began to circle him, their movements coordinated, flanking him, cutting off his escape. His heart hammered in his chest, not with fear, but with a cold, clear exhilaration. It had been too long since he'd had a proper fight. He backed away slowly, drawing them deeper into the main cavern. He needed a better weapon, a better position. His eyes scanned the area, cataloging every detail: the glowing moss, the strange rock formations, the thick, vine-like roots that snaked down from the ceiling. An idea, desperate and brutal, sparked in his mind. He feinted towards the one on his left, then spun and sprinted towards the far wall of the cavern, where a particularly large stalagmite rose from the floor, sharpened to a point by millennia of dripping water. The 3 beasts charged after him, a wave of claws and teeth. Just as the lead Graktheron lunged, its jaws snapping inches from his back, Rusty jumped. He grabbed one of the thick roots hanging from the ceiling, his calloused hands finding a sure grip. He swung his body up and around, using the momentum to plant his feet on the cavern wall. He pushed off hard, launching himself over the charging monsters' heads. He landed behind them, snatched a large, heavy chunk of crystalline rock from the ground, and charged the injured one. The beast was still turning, confused by his aerial maneuver. It was too slow. Rusty brought the jagged rock down on the back of its skull with savage, two-handed force. There was a wet, crunching sound, and the creature collapsed, its limbs twitching before falling still. One down. The other two shrieked in fury and charged again. Rusty met them head-on, a wild man covered in sweat and alien blood, armed with nothing but a rock and a lifetime of violence. It was a brutal, ugly dance. He used his speed and agility to stay out of their reach, delivering punishing blows whenever he saw an opening. He took a glancing hit from a whipping tail that sent him sprawling, the impact stealing the breath from his lungs. A clawed foot raked across his back, tearing deep furrows in his flesh. Pain exploded across his nerve endings, hot and white. He rolled, came up to one knee, and hurled the blood-slicked rock at the closest beast. It struck the creature in its yellow eye, which burst in a spray of ichor. The Graktheron reared back, screaming, clawing at its ruined face, and then a new sound cut through the chaos. A voice, synthetic, familiar, and utterly out of place. "Vance, Rusty, can you hear me, you overgrown ape?" It was Betsy. Her voice was weak, distorted by static, but it was unmistakably her. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a disembodied ghost in the machine. The distraction was almost fatal. The uninjured beast lunged, pinning him to the ground. Its weight was crushing, forcing the air from his lungs. Its hot, rotten breath filled his nostrils. The maw of teeth descended towards his face. He strained, his muscles screaming, pushing against the monster's immense weight. His hands found its throat, his thumbs digging into the soft tissue, but it was too strong. Suddenly, a shadow fell over them. Zelia stood above the beast, her face a mask of cold fury. She held a sharpened obsidian spear like a javelin. With a fierce cry, she drove it down with all her strength. The obsidian point punched through the Graktheron's armored neck, severing its spine with a wet, grinding sound. The beast went limp, its dead weight slumping onto Rusty. He shoved the carcass off him, gasping for air, his body screaming in a dozen different places. Zelia helped him to his feet, her touch surprisingly strong. They stood together, breathing heavily, surrounded by the dead. The immediate threat was over. "Betsy?" Rusty rasped, looking up at the cavern ceiling as if he could see her in orbit. "Betsy, report. Main power core rerouted," the static-laced voice replied. "Emergency. Repairs. 80% complete. I can achieve escape velocity. On your command. Get back to the ship, you sentimental fool. The hull is compromised, but the engine is alive. Freedom." The word was a jolt, more potent than adrenaline. He could leave. He could get back to the Betsy, blast his way out of this green hell, and disappear back into the familiar, lonely darkness of the void. He looked at the wreckage of the cavern, at the dead monsters and the terrified faces of the Viridian females peeking out from the tunnels. He looked at Zelia, her jade skin splattered with the black blood of the Graktheron, her chest heaving, her dark eyes fixed on him. She had saved his life, and Betsy was offering him his. He could see the crash site in his mind's eye, a few canyons over. It would be a hard run, but he could make it. He could be gone before the next wave of these things came, but if he left, the next wave would come, and there would be no one here to stop them. He would be condemning Zelia and her entire race to a slow, brutal extinction. He would be running again, leaving another life, another potential future, to burn behind him. The choice was clear, horribly, terrifyingly clear. He was a man defined by a broken promise. Maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to finally keep one. The silence that followed Betsy's transmission was heavier than the dead weight of the Graktheron at Rusty's feet. It was a silence filled with the unspoken choice that now lay before him, stark and unavoidable. Freedom, a concept he had chased across 100 star systems, was a voice in his ear, a tangible, achievable reality. It was a straight line back to the cold, uncomplicated solitude he craved, a straight line back to being a ghost. Zelia watched him, her hand still gripping the bloodied spear. She couldn't understand Betsy's words, but she understood the shift in his posture, the sudden, distant look in his eyes. She saw a man being pulled away by a force she couldn't see, a phantom tide threatening to drag him back to the sky. Her expression, once fierce with the thrill of the fight, now softened into a familiar, quiet desperation. She had seen him as a savior, then as a warrior. Now she feared she was about to see him as a memory. Rusty took a deep, ragged breath. the coppery smell of blood and the sweet scent of crushed fungi filling his lungs. He looked at the bodies of the slain beasts, then at the cavern entrance, a dark maw that promised more of the same. The Viridians had won this battle, but only because of him, and him only because of Zelia. Without a real plan, without taking the fight to the source, this victory was nothing more than a temporary stay of execution. He made his decision. It wasn't a lightning bolt of heroic clarity. It was a slow, grim settling in his gut, like a heavy stone finding its place at the bottom of a deep well. He had run from one fire. He would not run from this one. He would not leave these people to be slaughtered. "Betsy," he said, his voice a low, firm command that echoed in the cavern. "What's your offensive capability?" There was a pause, a crackle of static that sounded suspiciously like a synthetic sigh of disappointment. Minimal. Portside laser cannon is offline. Starboard phaser bank is slag. I have the main drive, and a hull that's barely holding together. Are you seriously suggesting what I think you are? You want to use a half-crippled antique freighter as a weapon? Got a better idea?" Rusty shot back. He began moving, his mind now fully engaged, working through tactical possibilities. He started issuing orders, not in Zelia's tongue, but in the universal language of gesture and intent. He pointed to the dead beasts, then made a dragging motion towards the cavern entrance. He needed bait. Zelia, seeing the fire of purpose rekindled in his eyes, immediately understood. She spoke to her people, her voice ringing with a newfound authority, an echo of his own decisiveness. The fear in the Viridian female's eyes was replaced by a grim determination. They had a leader. They had a plan. They had hope. The next few hours were a whirlwind of brutal, focused labor. Rusty, with Zelia as his interpreter and second in command, organized the Viridians. They dragged the Graktheran carcasses out of the nest and deep into a narrow box canyon, a click away from the crash site, a place he had noted during the initial descent, a natural kill box. They used the beast's black viscous blood to lay a scent trail, a gruesome invitation the alpha predator wouldn't be able to ignore. His body protested every movement. The gash on his back burned, his ribs screamed, and his muscles, pushed past their limits, trembled with exhaustion. Zelia stayed by his side, her presence a silent source of strength. At one point, as he paused to wipe sweat and blood from his brow, she approached with a poultice of crushed leaves. She gently applied it to the deep cuts on his back. Her touch was clinical, yet impossibly intimate. For a moment, in the eerie green twilight of the jungle, they were not a prophesied savior and a desperate queen. They were just a man and a woman, battered and weary, finding a moment of quiet connection before the coming storm. He didn't pull away. He let himself feel the warmth of her hand, a small anchor in a sea of violence. Finally, he stood on a ridge overlooking the crash site. The Betsy was a pathetic sight, her hull scorched and crumpled, buried nose first in the rich green earth. But he could see a faint, flickering light from the cockpit. The old girl was still alive. "All right, Betsy," he murmured into the open air. "Phase 1 is complete. Time to make some noise. On my mark, power up the main drive. Just a short, controlled burst. I want to rattle the teeth of every one of those bastards in a 5-click radius." "Rattling my own teeth is my primary concern," the AI retorted dryly. "Are you certain about this, Rusty? The engine housing is cracked. A full power burn could vent the core." "That's the idea, sweetheart," Rusty said with a grim smile. "That's the idea." He made his way to the killbox canyon, taking up a position on the cliffs high above the entrance. Zelia and a handful of the strongest females were with him, armed with sharpened spears and heavy rocks. Below, the bait lay waiting. Now, all they needed was the guest of honor. "Now, Betsy," he commanded. From the direction of the crash, a low hum began to build, quickly rising in pitch to a deafening roar. The ground trembled. A brilliant blue-white light erupted from the Betsy's stern, a concentrated blast of pure energy that vaporized trees and turned the soil to glass. It was the roar of a wounded starship, a defiant shout of power that echoed through the canyons for miles. It was a challenge. They didn't have to wait long. A deep guttural roar answered from the depths of the jungle, a sound of rage and territorial fury. The Alpha. It was coming. It was immense, a creature that dwarfed the others he had fought. Its armored hide was scarred and ancient, its yellow eyes burning with a primal hatred. It stormed into the canyon, its massive head low, sniffing the air, drawn by the scent of its dead kin and the audacious challenge of the ship. It stopped in the center of the canyon right over the bait and bellowed its dominance to the sky. "Betsy," Rusty's voice was a whisper. "Bring it home. It has been an interesting tenure of service, you sentimental brute." Betsy's voice crackled, and for the first time he thought he heard something other than sarcasm in her tone. Something that might have been affection. "Hold on to your ass." From the sky, the Betsy appeared. She was not a graceful sight. She was a falling, rumbling piece of junk, trailing smoke and plasma, but she was falling with purpose. Rusty had told her to give it everything she had left. A final suicidal dive bomb straight into the canyon. The Alpha Grak Theron looked up, its malevolent eyes widening in disbelief as 20 tons of angry, dying starship descended upon it. It roared, a sound of defiance that was cut short as the Betsy impacted. The explosion was biblical. The ship's damaged core went critical, unleashing a wave of pure white energy that scoured the canyon from wall to wall. The shockwave threw Rusty and the others back from the cliff edge, the roar deafening, the light blinding. For a long moment, the world was nothing but fire and thunder. When the echoes faded and the light subsided, Rusty crawled back to the edge and looked down. The canyon floor was a crater of molten rock and vaporized earth. There was no sign of the Alpha, of the bait, or of his ship. The Betsy was gone. The threat was gone. Silence descended. It was over. He returned to the nest, not as a hero returning from war, but as a man returning from a funeral. The Viridian females met him with a reverent silence, their dark eyes full of gratitude and awe. They had their future back, but he had lost his past. His ship, his music, his last tangible link to the man he used to be. It was all a cloud of radioactive dust at the bottom of a canyon. That night, Zelia came to him as he sat staring at the glowing moss on the ceiling. She carried no food, no medicine. She simply sat beside him, her presence a comforting warmth in the cool cavern. She didn't touch him. She didn't speak. She just shared his silence. He knew what she was offering: a home, a purpose, a new life, born from the ashes of the old, the chance to be the Sower, the hope, the man who brought life back to a dying world. It was everything a man could want. It was everything he was terrified of. Slowly, deliberately, he shook his head. A single, almost imperceptible movement. But she understood. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, the sorrow of a hope finally extinguished. But beneath it, there was acceptance, understanding. She had seen the ghosts he carried. She knew he was not a man meant for gardens. He was a creature of the void, a man born to wander. He stood up. He had nothing. No ship, no gear, only the torn pants on his legs and the scars on his skin. He walked to the cavern entrance and looked out at the alien jungle, at the 2 moons that now hung in the velvet black sky. His road was no longer between the stars but through this wilderness. He would survive. He always did. And eventually, he would find a way off this world. It's what he did. He moved on. Zelia came and stood beside him. She reached out and took his hand, her cool fingers lacing with his. She brought his hand to her lips and pressed a gentle kiss to his knuckles. It was not a kiss of passion, but of farewell, of respect, a thank you from an entire people. Then she placed something in his palm and closed his fingers around it. It was a single, smooth, dark seed, about the size of his thumb. It pulsed with a faint, internal green light. A seed of life, a promise. He nodded to her, a final, silent goodbye. Then he turned and walked out of the nest, away from the warmth and the light, and into the vast, lonely darkness of the Viridia canyons. He did not look back. He was Rusty Vance. He was the last outrider, and his journey, as always, was forward into the unknown. The weight in his soul was still there, but it felt different now. It wasn't just the weight of a promise broken. It was also the weight of a promise kept. True honor is not found in running from your past, but in facing a future you are not obligated to save. The road is long and lonely, but it's better when we travel together. If this story touched you, subscribe and share it with a friend who appreciates the old code of honor.